Welcome everyone to our training on Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams. This is a 4-part training series covering the upgrade from Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams. My name is Brian Nice. I am a Principal Program Manager within our Teams Engineering, Customer, and Partner team. Before we dive in, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Some additional resources include additional modules that can be found at aka.ms/Teams Academy. Additionally, we're looking for 2 types of feedback. For feedback on this session, you can go to aka.ms/Teams Community, create a new post, and add the IT Pro training tag. This will allow us to easily find your feedback for this session. If you're looking to provide feedback for various features of the Teams product itself, you can go to aka.ms/Teams Feedback. Keep in mind that Teams and Office 365 evolve constantly, so you should stay up to date on our blog at aka.ms/Teams blog. The slide also indicates the current version of this presentation. You are currently in Part 2, Planning the Paths to Teams. In this training, we'll be covering the Planning the Path to Teams agenda item. The previous agenda items were covered in our prior training, and the remaining 2 will be covered in subsequent trainings. Some key learnings for this particular training. Teams itself is much more than just a simple technical migration. There is a people change aspect that cannot be overlooked as part of the upgrade process. When we begin our planning, we should always start with a proven framework. The side-by-side approach is preferred, and in this instance, user adoption is super critical to be successful in this path. There are additional approaches that are available for complex scenarios, and we will detail these as we go throughout this training. So let's take a look at the various paths to Teams. We begin by planning our upgrade process. We need to ensure that we always start with a proven framework. And what we've built out here, as you can see evidenced by the URL at the bottom of this page, is an end-to-end process that can help enable customers and partners to plan, coexist, prepare users, and perform the upgrade when ready. This includes starting with our set of project stakeholders, moving through our project definition, building out our technical readiness and our user readiness capabilities, implementing our deployment and pilots and coexistence strategies, and finally building out our operational excellence to have our sustained operations and user adoption. So let's break these down in a little bit more detail over the next few slides. First, our project stakeholders. Do we have the right ones? I mean, obviously it's good to have stakeholders, but are they the right stakeholders? We need executive sponsors. Do we have the corresponding IT pros that we need in the discussions? Our user adoption and change managers, are they present and available? Have we identified a project lead? Have we identified a quality champion? These are all key roles that we see that we build out as part of our project team that can help us set the stage for the overall upgrade to Microsoft Teams. As a tip, define your roles and accountabilities as well as the various checkpoints that you need to make sure that your team stays very aligned throughout this entire process. Now we need to define our project. We need to consider what is the vision, what is the scope for the project. We're looking at digital transformation as an example, and changing the way our folks work on a daily basis. Well, let's understand what that full vision is and what that scope of that project is. Then you can lay out what your milestones are, determine what your end goals are, and most importantly, how you are going to measure whether this was successful or not. As part of the definition, we need to ensure that we set a baseline so we know where our current state is. And as part of that current state, we assess where we are with our current state of a Teams deployment. Maybe we haven't even started yet. Or perhaps as we're building this project, we're maybe part of the way through our team's deployment. Maybe we have a pilot running already. So we want to make sure that we assess the current state of our team's deployment and adoption. Then we can determine what the ideal path would be from the Skype for Business world to Teams. How are we going to handle coexistence? What is our timeline going to be? And so forth. We will cover those in greater detail as we go throughout the relevant trainings. As a tip, utilize SMART goals and implement a risk mitigation plan. This ensures that we keep our project on track. Technical readiness. This is the part that a lot of folks like to jump right towards, but realize where we are in this process, right? This is the third piece of the puzzle that we're looking at here. Readying our environment for Teams. Do the IT staff have what they need? Whether that's tool sets, whether that's training and knowledge or what have you, do they have what they need to manage this migration? Does your environment technically meet the requirements for Teams, right? Do we have SharePoint in place, SharePoint Online in place? Do we have Exchange? Where do we sit with OneDrive for Business, the various components that Teams utilizes, right? Where is our Azure Active Directory or our synchronization happening, right? How do we prepare the network? Is it ready for real-time communications? How are we going to ensure that we have proper quality for that particular network? How do we handle our endpoints, whether they're headsets? Are they certified headsets? Are they certified devices? And so forth. And how are we going to configure Teams for our users? Right? What aspects of Teams are we going to enable from the end user perspective to ensure that we have the right technical components available? Quality of experience is, of course, critical in driving the users to Teams. Teams in and of itself is very similar to Skype for Business in the sense that it's what we commonly refer to as the, quote, canary in the coal mine, unquote, which means that if there's an underlying challenge with your network or something of that nature, Teams will probably find it and Teams will probably get blamed for it. So as a result, we want to ensure that we have a good quality of experience to ensure that our users are happy with utilizing Teams. As such, we should enlist a quality champion to help ensure that our network not only starts out in, but remains in a healthy state. On top of the technical aspects, of course, we can't forget to ready the organization, that is, the users themselves. We have to look at the broad scope of projects that may be running in parallel at the moment so that we can understand first and foremost how many other changes are currently planned. Generally not a good idea to hit users with tons of changes all at the same time. What does the change culture look like for your organization? Do we have a predominant set of laggards that are slow to adopt? Do we have a predominant set of innovators that are very quick to adopt change? Do we hit across the board and have a little bit of everything, right? What is the predominant change culture that we use? Who are those key personas that we're going to work with? And what are the scenarios that teams can provide from a teamwork perspective that will give the most, what we call bang for the buck, right? What's the most benefit that we can get for readying our organization and utilizing Teams? Most critical, what is the value for the user to adopt Teams, right? What's in it for me? Users have to understand a reasoning for change to be able to embrace it. What are you going to use as your communication mechanisms, your training, your support channels, right? How do you leverage that? Do you have a mechanism in place for that today? Do you have a partner that you work with for this? Do you have in-house training expertise? How are you going to build out that particular regiment that we need? And how are you going to build out your champions program to ensure that you have that support that's driven by peers that are utilizing the platform? Remember that people aren't going to just automatically change, and they're also not going to be a one-size-fits-all type approach. We need to ensure that we take our time and assess our user propensity for change. That will then allow us to build a proper readiness program to meet the end user's needs, which will in turn result in them developing a more deep habitual usage of this particular platform. Step is to implement our upgrade plan. This is where we determine the components for our pilot So we understand who those participants are, what the pilot timeline is, the various test plan components that we need, and of course the end goals of that pilot. From there, we can define our go and no-go decision points to determine, based on the results of our pilot, if we're going to proceed into the next phase of the upgrade strategy. Once we then transition to that next stage of the upgrade strategy, we need to determine how many users are we going to migrate. Are we going to, say, for example, finish our pilot and then simply migrate the rest of the company all at once? Or are we going to do them in a cycle where we have batches of users that are being migrated over a period of time? How do we monitor and iterate as we go? Because as we hit various persona types and so forth, we may learn some new things that require us to adapt and tweak and change the upgrade strategy as we go. The formal pilot itself helps you to validate that particular plan that you've built on a much smaller scale. That's a lot more manageable than trying to validate your plan across a 10,000 seat deployment. Now, it is critically important when we build the pilot that we have a great cross-representation of our users. We don't just want to grab IT, because that's not a great representation of our end user population. So we should have a good representation of various personas, including some power users in the Skype for Business world, so that we can understand where they may identify challenges moving forward into teams. And don't forget, you probably want to get some of the laggards too, because again, we want to understand how we're going to need to adapt and iterate our upgrade strategy as we move throughout this deployment. Lastly, we move into our operate and amplified teams adoption step. Some considerations here. What are we going to measure our success against? What are our goals that we're working towards? How do we mitigate? How do we iterate? How do we ensure that this particular deployment is successful? How do you manage the operations on a day-to-day basis, right? What are the pieces that we're going to be looking towards? What are tool sets that we're going to be able to use? What is our plan for monitoring quality within the environment? How do we maintain the momentum to grow adoption for teams, to ensure that our users are really transforming the way that they work rather than trying something out for a day or two and then just kind of putting it back in the drawer? And then how do we optimize the teamwork strategy overall? Again, Teams is much more than just simply a replacement for Skype for Business where we do chat, calling, and meetings. It's an evolution of how we do teamwork. So how do we optimize that strategy? How do we optimize that digital transformation that we do as an organization? Of course, initial excitement can wane, right? The novelty of it wears off, as we call it. We want to be able to sustain our results with an operational plan that helps by including network and quality checks, user adoption excitement, product innovation deployment, right? Help the users to understand that it's not just a simple once and done, but that we are continuing to evolve the platform and continuing to innovate in ways that can help them in their daily routine. You can get to Teams from Skype for Business. Navigating the journey is not as difficult as it may seem. It's all about mapping your upgrade journey. Just like any destination, there's multiple ways to get to Teams. If I'm going to go on a vacation, there's multiple ways that I can get to my vacation destination as well. In the case of going to Teams from Skype for Business, well, your organization may opt to go directly from Skype for Business straight into what we call Teams only mode, right? You may just simply deploy Teams, flip everybody to Teams only, and away we go. Or you may choose to run Skype for Business and Teams together for a particular period of time with selected modalities and so forth. So let's take a look at the first example where we're upgrading from a pure Skype for Business online environment. Let's look at our first example. This company is a pure Skype for Business online organization, and we're going to look at this from the user's perspective. Now, our starting point, as we see on the slide here, the users are utilizing Skype for Business Online today, and they're utilizing Skype for chat, meeting, and calling. We're going to look at what we call the full side-by-side approach. In this instance, for this organization that is using Skype Online, we introduce Teams side by side with full functionality next to the Skype for Business client. So as you can see on the slide here, Skype is using chat, meeting, and calling, and we've now introduced Teams as well with all of the various features enabled, including chat, meetings, calling, and collaboration, as well as any extensibility options that we have. By enabling this scenario, this allows users to experience the full benefits of Teams digital transformation right out of the box because we've lit up all of the various features of Teams. But if we take this side-by-side approach, we must be aware of the fact that all of our users need to be running both the Skype for Business client and the Teams client at all times until they become Teams-only users or until they've been upgraded. Right? This is to ensure that the users can get the experiences that they require out of both applications because those applications are running side by side. Of course, the eventual end state will be an upgrade into what we call Teams only mode, where the Teams client is the only application where they're utilizing chat, calling, meeting scheduling, collaboration, and so forth. So if we look at a visual representation of this, my organization today could be utilizing Skype for Business Online, and we're fully saturated, all users, all in, using all of our features of Skype for Business. We then deploy Teams side by side with Skype for Business Online, but turn on all of the functionality within Teams. So now the users have both clients running, and they have all features available in both clients. We continue to drive rapid adoption across the organization to a saturation point, ensuring that all of our users are utilizing Teams while we still have Skype for Business enabled. So they still have the capabilities of doing all the things that they were doing in Skype for Business, but we've also now introduced the Teams application with all of its capabilities as well. As we drive that rapid adoption across the org, it gives us the capability of now being able to start that transition to Teams only. Once we've hit that saturation level of adoption, we've got all of our items accounted for, including room devices, including any devices like headsets or phones. We can then take the entire organization all at once into Teams only mode. That gets us to Teams only as rapidly as possible. I mean, ideally all at once is the approach, but as rapidly as possible ensures that they get the best experience possible within Teams, and they have the shortest amount of time where they transition from Skype for Business. Now let's take a look at a scenario that's a little bit more complex than an organization that's utilizing pure Skype for Business Online. Again, we're going to look at this from the user's point of view. And this particular example, the company that we're working with is a combination of either an on-premises organization or a hybrid organization where they're utilizing Skype for Business on-premises and Skype for Business Online together in a split domain config. This is also an approach that you can take if end users are a little confused with having overlapping functionality between two applications. So, our starting point, our user is in Skype for Business. Again, that could be Skype for Business on premises, or the user could be Skype for Business Online as part of hybrid. And they're using the Skype client for the various communications modalities, including chat, meeting scheduling, and calling. We then introduce Teams to the user, but in this particular scenario, we introduce a subset of functionality within the Teams application. As you can see on the slide here, the Skype client is doing chat, meeting scheduling, and calling, but when we introduce the Teams client, we're only introducing the collaboration aspects of Teams. In this scenario, all the calls and chats will continue to land in and originate from Skype for Business client. So this gives the user the ability to explore some net new functionality of Teams, specifically the collaboration aspects, the teams, channels, apps, and so forth, without introducing overlapping functionality of the Teams application. Of course, over time, we will move this process forward to grab select folks and switch their communications functionality over to Microsoft Teams. So as we see here, the chat, the meeting scheduling functionality, and the calling have now landed in Teams. This is our what we call Teams only mode. As we do this over time, users that have not been upgraded, basically the ones that are in the middle here, they will utilize interop to communicate with the folks that have been upgraded over here, right? Because at this stage of the game, some of our users are in Teams only, and that's all they have is their Teams client. And other users are in this mode here where all of their chat and calling is within Skype. So let's look at a particular variation of this where we have the organization that wants to perform the upgrade, but not looking to have overlapping functionality. In this first example here, there is no prior Teams usage, meaning what we see here is our Skype for Business client rolled out to our entire user population, and nobody has started using Teams as of yet. In this instance, we introduce Teams. Teams runs alongside Skype for Business, but there's no overlap of functionality. So Skype for Business is still doing the chat, meeting scheduling, and calling. The Teams client is utilizing the collaboration features. Now we begin a pilot of Teams. In this instance, we get a select set of users where we introduce the UC functionality to these users within Teams. Now, during this process, the folks that are in the pilot, of course, will still be able to communicate to the users that are in the rest of the user population that are using Skype for Business through our interop mechanisms. The presence of a user, whether they're available or busy or so forth, will be aligned with the appropriate routing, meaning that on our left-hand side, the folks that are using Skype for Business, presence will be driven by Skype. The folks that are in our pilot that are using Teams, presence will be driven by Teams. The pilot will, of course, expand such that we'll have the capability of utilizing Teams throughout the entire organization, and eventually our original user population will decrease to 0 and our organization will complete the upgrade to Teams. Let's take a slight variation on the example of an organization that wants to perform the upgrade without overlapping functionality, but they do have a set of users that have already started to use Teams. So here, in this variation, you see at the top, we have a set of users that are utilizing simply Skype for Business. So again, they could be on premises, they could be in online as part of hybrid, but that's all they have is their Skype for Business client. But down at the bottom, we see a set of users that have not only used the Skype for Business client, but have also been given the Teams application. And in this case, they've been given the Teams application with all of the various features enabled. So we have a couple sets of users within our user population. In this example, of course, we can begin to introduce the Teams application to the remaining set of the user population without the UC capabilities, right? The collaboration aspects. And the remaining users that were already starting to use Teams, we simply don't mess with them. Let them continue doing what they're doing and use their Teams application as well as their Skype for Business application together. We can then begin the pilot of Teams only or the upgrade to Teams. And this would involve taking users out of both sets of the user population and transitioning them or upgrading them into this Teams only experience. It's highly recommended that the folks that are using both Skype for Business and Teams together down here, that these guys get moved over into Teams only mode as rapidly as possible. All right, so these are some great candidates down here for the beginnings of our Teams pilot, but of course we don't want to just isolate it to simply that group, so we want to make sure that we get folks out of this user population that's utilizing both Skype and Teams together. Of course, the pilot will expand. Our Teams only mode will grow and grow and grow such that we will realize all of our users being successfully upgraded to using Teams only, and the remaining population that was using Skype for Business will reduce to 0, and our migration is complete. In this example, we'll look at the upgrade from a user's point of view for an organization that wants to start with the meetings workload first from Microsoft Teams. Now, this is typically for on-premises organizations that are looking to make the move to Microsoft Teams as the end destination, but they're going to take a more methodical approach and move the meetings workload first. Now, our starting state here is a user that is utilizing their Skype for Business client as expected, so using it for chat, using it for meeting scheduling, using it for calling. Now, we could choose to introduce Teams to the user without the UC functionality as we described in our previous example. This is where we light up the Teams client for the collab only type features while they continue to use chat, meeting scheduling, and calling in Skype for Business. But as our next step in our upgrade process, we then introduce the Teams client with the addition of the meetings workload. This in turn switches the meeting functionality from the Skype for Business on-premises deployment to Microsoft Teams. And as you can see here, we're now in a state where the users are using the Skype client for chat and calling, but they're utilizing the Teams client for meeting scheduling and group collaboration. So as such, when we're in this state, all calls, all chats are going to initiate from and land in Skype for Business because those workloads are still here, while new meetings are created within the Teams environment. Now, as we continue on the upgrade path, of course, we're going to get our users to this final end state, which is Teams only mode. And that's where you see all of the various features, including chat, meeting scheduling, calling, collaboration, and so forth, are now available only within the Teams application itself. Now, as this will probably happen over time, the users that have been upgraded to Teams only mode will enjoy all of the various features that you see here. They will, of course, still be able to communicate with users that are in the state that you see here, because these users will be utilizing their Skype for Business client. This will be through our interop mechanism that will allow the user that is still here using Skype for Business to be able to chat with the user over here and call with the user over here that has been upgraded to Teams. Visually, if we look at the example where an organization wants to start with the meetings workload first, it would look like this. Our starting user population is utilizing Skype for Business, and in this case, this could be on-premises Skype for Business server. We introduce Teams. Optionally, we could introduce Teams just with the collaboration aspects as you see here, or you could begin straight at this step of introducing meetings first. But if we follow the visual representation here, we start with our users in Skype for Business with Teams and collaboration only. Then we begin our meetings first pilot. This allows us to start to introduce the Teams client with the meetings workload, the ability to schedule net new meetings now within the Teams application. We, of course, would have this environment and pilot experience grow to the point where ideally we would then have our entire organization at the state that you see here, which is our Skype users still doing chat and calling, whereas the Teams components are taking care of the scheduling of meetings and the collaboration aspects. Continuing on through this upgrade process, we would then begin our pilot of the Teams only experience. Again, as we see here, this is all of the various features that are available within Teams. And we would continue this deployment time over time, group by group, until we have all of our organization over to Teams only and the meetings first initiative reduced to 0. This would then complete the migration, allowing us, as you saw here, to kind of use that stepping stone approach where we can introduce the collaboration and meetings aspects first, and then over time transition to the final end state, which is Teams only. Let's recap the key learnings from this training. Teams is more than a technical migration. There is a people change aspect that is critical to the overall upgrade process. Planning should always start with a proven framework. While doing your upgrade, the side-by-side approach is the preferred approach. However, user adoption is super critical in this path. There are additional approaches available for more complex scenarios, including on-premises migrations from Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams. Be sure to check out the other trainings that are part of this series of the Skype to Teams upgrade. Thank you for attending this session.